So hello everybody and welcome. Thank you for joining this session, Interpreting Standards, Past, Present, and How the New Frontier is Influencing the Future. I'm Victoria Powers and I will be the MC for today's session. First, I would like to remind you that if you have any questions for our speaker, please use the button in your control panel marked Q&A, and we will try to get to as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Conor Power, formerly the founder and CEO of Interpreter Intelligence, the #1 platform for managing language services, supporting both in-person and remote interpreting. Conor started Interpreter Intelligence in 2011 and has grown the business organically, and is now fortunate to work with some of the largest language service companies in the world, using Interpreter Intelligence to manage their in-person interpreting services. Interpreter Intelligence was recently acquired by Buslingo, the leading provider of software solutions for the interpretation industry. Conor now serves as the VP of Engineering for Buslingo, focusing on product and technology. I'll now hand the session over to you, Conor.
Thank you, Victoria. So let me just share my presentation here. 1 second while I select this. Okay, perfect. So hopefully everybody can see my PDF slides right now. I'll assume that's a yes. Okay, cool. So thanks for joining me here today. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in San Diego in person. I'm actually in the middle of a move to London. I'm actually here in London, and it's just the timing didn't work out. I thought I might be in London a few months ago and be able to attend GALA in person. But I appreciate you joining me on this virtual session today. So what I'm going to go through today is look at interpreting standards, both past, present, and with what the new frontier brings to us with these interpreting standards. So let me go ahead, next one. So first off, the agenda, what we're going to cover today is a quick introduction. I think Victoria gave me a nice introduction. I may just revisit that quite quickly. We'll cover, there's a couple of polls that I wanted to get from the audience just to see the type of participants that we had on the virtual call today. We'll take a look at why standards are important, you know, if it's not obvious to everybody, and some of the challenges with adopting standards, particularly in the interpretation industry. We look at some of the origins of the current standards in interpreting. We'll take a look at the current state, and then finally we'll talk at the very end about what the new frontier has brought to us. And I think with the advent of COVID over the last 2 years, it's quite obvious what this new frontier entails. And then we'll try and keep the last few minutes for some Q&A. Hopefully there'll be some Q&A that I can try and address at the end of the call. Okay. So very quickly, so as Victoria said, my name is Conor Power. I'm the VP of Engineering at Buslingo. So my company, my previous company, Interpreter Intelligence, was a platform for language companies to manage their interpretation services. We were recently acquired by Buslingo, and around the same time, Buslingo also acquired another company called VoiceBoxer, which is a remote simultaneous interpreting platform provider. So a very exciting time for me personally and for us to be in the industry, and happy to be able to share that with you here today. So before we get going, I had a couple of polls that I wanted to get feedback from people on. The first one is, what is your primary role in the language industry? And Victoria, if you could pop that up on screen, would be great. So are you an interpreter, translator? Perhaps you're both an interpreter and translator, or perhaps you're other, maybe an executive or just someone working for a language company. Okay, and then I guess as answers come in, Victoria, you can. Oh, I see it here. Actually, there's a poll here. Okay, it looks like, I don't know if this is visible to everybody, Victoria, or it will be momentarily, but it looks like most people are both interpreters and translators, and then about 15% interpreters and translators, and then about 85% other, which is great. So hopefully for those other folks, there'll be some interesting learnings here today. So then the next question I had was, for those people who are interpreters or are translators, do you have any certifications currently? That would be a yes, not yet, but I plan to, or no. The hope being that most professional linguists at the conference today are more than likely have some type of certification. But I see a pretty close split here at the moment, 50-50. Okay, and I see not as many respondents to this question. 75% no certifications, and 25% yes. And I think, Victoria, we can actually skip the last question, just given the fact that most people are not interpreters or translators. So I was curious to see, for those people who were interpreters or translators, what certification that they possessed was. But again, we'll skip through that and move on to the next slide, if that's okay. Okay. So what we're going to cover now is why are standards and certification important? I think the first obvious reason is quality. You know, in any professional setting, we need to ensure that the service we're providing is of a sufficient quality. Secondly, access to language is a civil and a human right. You know, from a refugee or an immigration setting, you know, these are very challenging settings for the interpreter to be in. Also, very challenging context for the limited English proficiency person to be in. It can be a medical setting, maybe a legal setting, or a law enforcement setting, or a community setting. Just go here for a moment. Excuse me. Here in the US, well, not here. In the US, you know, Title IV of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And as such, people are entitled to access to medical services and also legal services in their native language. And buyer confidence is another big reason why quality standards exist. You know, business or commercial setting, people want to ensure that the service they're purchasing is of an adequate and sufficient quality. Professionalism. So, of course, I think when interpretation, community interpreting, particularly in the last 30 years, very likely started off with you know, a family member or perhaps a friend interpreting in that setting. You know, these are very you know, situations where professionalism is required. You know, these are complex and challenging contexts for the limited English speaker, and they're sensitive settings where discretion is required. And educating both the buyer and the limited English speaker in terms of what's required in that setting is very, very important. Importantly, with quality and higher standards, we get improved outcomes. So poor outcomes can range from simple misunderstandings to life-changing consequences for the party that's been interpreted on behalf of. Some of the challenges that we have when thinking about creating standards or adopting standards. So again, interpreting is a very challenging field. You know, arguably much more so than translation, which is the written word. And in the interpreting setting, it's a real-time setting. And we're not just looking at language proficiency or competency. So they need to be beyond conversant in the language. They need to have a mastery to the same level of the native tongue, to be fluent in the source language, and to be able to interpret between languages. There needs to be a cultural proficiency, so a cultural awareness of the norms. There's a domain level expertise. So of course, there's a medical setting, perhaps there's a court setting, maybe there's a law enforcement setting. You know, this may be someone who's been arrested and perhaps is in a high stress situation. An immigration setting where perhaps refugees are entering the country. They need to be interpreted for. A business setting, which is a more professional setting, or a conference. And then finally a school setting. So again, the interpreter needs to be able to act and carry out their service in any of these environments. Professionalism is key. So their interactions with the limited language proficiency individual, interactions with the buyer, they need to be able to handle themselves professionally and provide the service to a high standard in an often complex and heated situation. In addition to the spoken interpretation, oftentimes they're called upon to do sight translation, which is to interpret or translate a written document. Perhaps it's a legal document or maybe a medical document on the spot. And of course, they need to be able to do note taking for reference purposes later on. There is also many ethical considerations. You know, these are very sensitive settings, you know, where perhaps they may be, particularly for in-person interpreting, may be involved in the immigrant community. They're perhaps well known. They're interpreting for individuals that perhaps they may come across in their day-to-day life. So there's a need for a well-defined code of ethics and standards. And then when you add to that the modalities that interpreting, you know, goes into. So we have consecutive interpreting, which is where somebody says something, the interpreter then repeats that in the target language. and so on. We have simultaneous interpreting, which more commonly happens in a booth setting, perhaps at a conference. And then, of course, we have different modalities nowadays, which are both, over the phone, video, or in person. So all of which makes up for a very complex and sophisticated professional setting for interpreters to do their business and to provide a quality of service to both the limited language proficiency and to the buyer of the service or the user of the service. Okay. So when we think of some of the origins for interpreting, so it's fair to say that interpreting long existed before translation. This is the spoken or the communication of visual cues between parties. They say that Christopher Columbus had Arabic and Hebrew interpreters on his voyage to the New World, of course, which were not of much use to him at the time with the languages that he encountered, the Indian languages. In the 18th and 19th century, Italian and French were really the language of the aristocracies and became the common language through which people interacted with each other. Consecutive interpreting was the norm for for people who needed it. It wasn't until the end of the First World War with the Treaty of Versailles, where the ensuing League of Nations, where multilingualism became, a thing. So in those situations, people rejected French and favored the languages of their native tongue. And of course, during these conferences, people needed to be able to interact in an efficient manner, and consecutive interpreting was not a viable option. So at this point, simultaneous interpreting became the norm. And it really was the birth of the League of Nations that multilingualism became a thing. Subsequent to that, we had, of course, the Second World War. So much of this and the Nuremberg trials. And this was really the first widespread adoption of simultaneous interpreting. Subsequent to that, we had the formation of the United Nations. Consecutive interpreting was no longer useful or practical in these situations. And it's fair to say that technology was a driving force that allowed simultaneous interpreting to become widely adopted. There were some inventions by IBM, I think in the early 1900s, that allowed the Nuremberg trials to be carried out successfully. And I think, as you'll see a bit later on, if technology was the forebearer of the advent of simultaneous interpreting, it's fair to say that some of the what's happened during COVID has really been the forebearer of what may be to come in the future. Okay, interpreting really as a profession didn't exist before the 1940s. I think it was being taught in some educational institutions, but it wasn't a profession. Really became a profession interpreting really was relatively unknown prior to that. All of a sudden, after the 1940s, the United Nations, it became high profile. It's a very demanding career. There was a broadening adoption in conference and commercial settings, and meeting sizes, of course, grew as business interacted with more and more globalization. The International Association of Conference Interpreters was formed in 1953. So the acronym for that is AIIC, which is a French organization. In English, it's the International Association of Conference Interpreters. And they were really the driving force behind the first advent of standardization and professionalization within the interpreting industry. The profile and usage grew greatly. Professional standards were agreed upon and started to be adopted. And of course, this led to greater quality standards throughout the profession. And of course, with any service that becomes more high profile, more demanding, there are of course some commercial motivations behind this as well, whereby companies providing the service and demanding a premium for what they provide, of course, wanted to have some type of minimum barrier to entry. So again, standardization and certification provided some mechanism for that minimum barrier to entry. I covered that, so let me just go past that. So when we think of interpreting standards, a couple of things come to mind. First off is, of course, language proficiency and competency. So how skilled are the individual providing the service in their language pairing? So in their A language, which is where they have a mastery, and of course the B language, which is their target language they're interpreting into. What is that? This is the initial barrier for anybody to provide service in this area. They need to have a mastery in their A language and, of course, fluency in any of the B languages that they provide. Professionalism is another key part of this. So not simply something to be undertaken as a hobby or a convenience. It's a formally organized profession which they're undertaking as to provide service to. They're practicing it as a full-time occupation. There's specialized training, education of an exceptional duration and perhaps of an exceptional difficulty is required. and the exercise of professional judgment and authority and autonomy restrained by responsibility is required in these settings. So professionalism is a key part of this. So it's not just language proficiency, but it's the ability to provide this language service under stressful conditions to a high level of professionalism. Underpinning this, then, of course, we have qualification and certification. So what qualifications can one attain? And what is the ongoing commitment to development within the profession, and what are the certifying bodies within the organizations that they can certify the level of service within? So in the next few slides, we're going to take a little bit of a look at the current state of each of those. So from a proficiency perspective, from a professionalism perspective, and then finally from a qualification and certification perspective. Okay. So I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of higher education. So the good news here is that from a proficiency perspective, there's a lot of universities, private institutions which provide higher level education from both a bachelor's perspective, from a master's perspective, and even from a doctorate perspective for people who want to pursue a career in linguistics. For example, here in California, we have the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, provided graduate degrees in both interpreting and translation for more than 50 years. There are community colleges, perhaps not at the advanced degree levels, that also provide diplomas, certificates in linguistic studies. There's many sign language training programs available both here in the UK and also in the States and state by state across the US. Practical training is also a very important part of this. So not just language proficiency, but can people, interpreters in this case, carry out their service in these real-time settings, which are oftentimes in a medical setting, perhaps in a legal setting, and oftentimes under stress, under duress. So practical training is a very important part of developing proficiency, not just in the language, but in the ability to carry out the service in those settings. I think the ability to be qualified or to attain a certain qualification in that demonstrates a proficiency in the language and a willingness at a professional level to provide the service that they have signed up for. From a standards perspective, we said that adherence to a standard demonstrates this professionalism. The standards define the competencies that the interpreter must adhere to, the necessary and desirable skills while providing the service. What are the minimum professional standards for quality services in language interpreting? So it doesn't just talk about the ability to have a mastery in their native tongue, or perhaps in the language that they interpret for, or even their B languages, but also what are the professional standards that are expected? How do we measure that? How do we test against it? Who is the target audience of these standards? So I think when we get into some of the international standards, it's fair to say that many of the target audience for these standards are organizations that provide language services. But I think we need to also consider, how do we target the individual interpreters? So again, these ISO standards and the ASTM standards at the international level, these are predominantly targeting for the organizations, the language service companies, the hospitals, the courts that are providing access to language services, are providing those services as a brokerage. But again, we need to consider the individual interpreters and the standards that they can attain. National standards do exist in many cases, particularly in the Western world. Any progressive societies will generally see more adoption of national standards at the government level, perhaps for medical work or for legal work. And then, of course, we're looking at private organizations to help develop standards of professional conduct, code of ethics, and standard practices. So again, these are generally organizations that interpreters can align themselves against, they can sign up, they can register for, and they can also be tested on an ongoing basis to ensure that they're keeping up to date with these codes of professional conduct and ethics and standard practices. Go on to the next. In the US here at this, not here, I'm now in the UK, in the US at the state level, we have standards for court interpreting or legal interpreting. So National Center for State Courts cover that. Interpreters can be certified at in many states. If there's not a certification available in their language pairing, then they can register, which involves passing a number of tests. So there's a hierarchy in most of these cases where the interpreter can get a higher degree, can then become certified, perhaps from a legal perspective or a medical perspective. And in the legal setting, if they don't have a certification, or perhaps they haven't passed a certification for that language pairing, they can always register, which involves a lower standard to entry, but still a standard to entry that's required to be able to do work at these court levels. There are a number of private organizations that exist. So again, the International Association of Conference Interpreters, another competing organization, the American Association of Language Specialists. We have the Chartered Institute of Linguistics here in the UK, the Institute of Interpreting and Translating, two organizations in the US around medical certification are the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare, certificate, the CCHI, the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters. And in the sign language world, we have the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. And I believe there's something equivalent here in the UK. Ongoing education is an important part of any of these standards and certifications bodies that they've developed. From an international perspective, we have the ISO, so I won't go into too much detail here. There's a lot of international standards, but most importantly is this 18841, which is Interpreting Services, General Requirements and Recommendations. It's a 15 page document, but again, I think these are primarily targeted at the organizations providing interpreting services. And the key takeaway here is that these standards are relatively new. So in the grand scheme of things, if you look back at the origins of the interpreting standards, they really go back to the 1940s, 1950s. It's no surprise that the standards that we're now seeing being adopted across the industry are really in the last 10 or 15 years, okay? It's also fair to say that simultaneous interpreting was the driving force, or conference interpreting was the driving force behind many of these international standards, not just from a quality of delivery, but also from an equipment perspective. Okay, so let me go. It's worth pointing out we also have an organization similar to the ISO in the US. It's called the Association of Testing and Materials. It provides its own committee for interpreter certification and standardization. It's worth checking out their website to see how companies can align themselves with those standards. But I should press on. At the US federal level, we have the State Department, which assesses professionally qualified and language skilled individuals. There's federal certification for court interpreters, but the list of languages that you can get certification in is very limited. So Spanish, Navajo, and Haitian Creole. If you don't attain the federal certification, you become professionally qualified, which is passing a conference or a seminar test, or perhaps a UN test. And then finally, the third tier at the federal level in the US is what we call language skilled or ad hoc interpreters. In the US, there's also the certified medical interpreter, or the core CHI or the CHI, which is the core CHI is available in any language, but the CHI is only available in limited languages. And I think the key takeaway here is that, certification where available is often in a very limited set of languages that interpreters can be certified against, which is one of the biggest challenges that there is in terms of certification worldwide. It's not that certifications or standards don't exist, it's that it's not possible to get certified in many, many language pairings. And from a other national perspective, in the UK, we have the DPSI, which is the Diploma in Public Service Interpreting. This covers both law, health, local government. There's also a national register for public service interpreting. And I should hurry up here a little bit. So let me just get past this. It's fair to say that many national organizations, they have a registry of interpreters. So they have a proficiency level from a language competency perspective, and also a registry of fully vetted, qualified interpreters. So anybody who's looking for certification, or anybody who's looking to buy interpreters for these languages, that would be the first stopping point for any of these services. So before we run out of time, I wanted to quickly talk about the new frontier. So of course, I think as people are aware, global migration is increasing. Language access is a human right, is increasing. There's a certain awareness, particularly in Western countries, that people demand or should be provided access to services in their native language. The number of languages that we need to interpret for is increasing. All in all, more linguists are needed. So how can we improve access to interpretation while meeting quality? There's going to be more opportunities for qualification and certification. In-person interpreting makes the shortage more acute. So really, when we think of the new frontier in COVID, we think of remote work, cost-effective for the buyer, allows us to maximize utilization for the linguist. It's convenient for the linguist. And with remote work, of course, we get better access to continuing education. Let me go back to the next page. And most importantly, interconnectivity online. So it's not just the ability to provide the service remotely in an efficient and cost-effective manner, it's also being able to connect with other interpreters in a community setting. I think a key thing is when we try and increase language access is to get more linguists involved in the field. And it's fair to say that interpreting with some of the complex situations that linguists need to interpret in, they need to look after themselves. So we need to make sure that interpreters have enough adequate support for self-care. Trauma is a genuine issue in the industry. If we want to increase the number of linguists providing this service, that's going to be an important part. So given that it's 4 minutes left, Victoria, I wanted to hand it back to you for any Q&A.
Thank you very much, Conor. And if anyone has any questions, please write them in the Q&A. Maybe to start us off, I have a question for you, which touches on something you were talking about before. Is there any movement towards an international certification?
Yeah, I think there's the two main organizations that I covered. One is the ISO, International Standards Organization, and the second is the ASTM. So they both have well-defined standards for the provision of language services, but they're predominantly targeted at the actual organizations, the language service companies providing the service. We haven't seen an international standard targeting the actual individual linguists so far. I think there's room there for that. It does bring on the next question, was how do linguists afford, because these ISO standards are generally not inexpensive. But I think there's opportunity there to targeting the individual linguists.
Great, thank you. And what about if there's no certification available for your language pair, what can you do to stand out?
I think your best bet is, so depending upon the country that you're based in, there's oftentimes a national register or some type of place that you can sign up and get registered. And generally, to be on that register, you need to meet certain professional criteria. That's professional standards, code of ethics. So there's training involved in that. So I think the first step would be for you to reach out to your national association, figure out what that national register is, and figure out how to get your name on that list as a registered interpreter.
Great, that's really great advice. Thank you. And maybe one more question. So how do we best educate the institutions that we work with that certification and standardization are a good thing and that they're worth pursuing? As you said, they're quite expensive sometimes. So how can we best educate the institutions?
I think the key thing is to get involved. So understand who your local organizations that provide awareness in the industry. Get involved with those organizations. Those organizations are invariably doing some work already in that regard. So really, just to have your voice be heard. Consider it is a profession. It's a very demanding profession. So get involved with your local organizations and help spread the word.
Okay. Well, thank you to everyone for attending, and big thank you to Conor for your presentation. The recording will be available afterwards, and we hope to see you all at the next session. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you. Enjoyed the conference.